My name's Richard Cole, and if you're hearing this, you probably believe, like most folks do, that family is everything. I used to believe that too. Hell, I built my whole life around it. See, in a small town like Cedar Falls, family's not just who you eat Sunday dinner with, it's who you are. The Cole name meant something here once. My old man, Frank Cole, built homes, barns, and lives with those hands of his. Folks trusted him not just because he was good at what he did, but because when Frank gave you his word, it was as solid as the oak he worked with. And me? I was proud to be his son, until the day I learned that sometimes the blood in your veins ain't half as pure as the loyalty you thought you shared. That morning started like any other. I was out on my porch before sunrise, coffee in hand, watching the fog roll off the cornfields. The boards under my chair groaned, same ones Dad and I built 30 years back. The world felt steady then, routine, predictable, safe. Then my phone buzzed. I remember the sound like a bullet slicing through quiet air. It was from Mr. Hendricks, Dad's lawyer. Good man, older than me, steady voice, the kind who never called unless it mattered. "Morning, Rick," he said, a little too calm. "I've been meaning to reach you. Your father's will was read and executed yesterday." I smiled faintly. "Yeah, so it's official now?" There was a pause. A heavy one. The kind that tells you the world's about to tilt under your feet. "I'm sorry to inform you," he said, "but everything has been transferred to your brother, Daniel Cole." My coffee cup slipped clean out of my hand. It hit the porch and shattered, spilling black across the wood like it was bleeding. I didn't even flinch, just stared straight ahead, watching steam rise off the mess, wondering if I'd heard him wrong. "Everything," I whispered. "Yes, Richard. The estate, the workshop, the house, the land. All in Daniel's name." I hung up. Didn't even say goodbye. The line went dead, but that silence roared louder than thunder. For a long time, I just sat there, didn't move, didn't blink. You ever have one of those moments where the world just stops, where time hangs like dust in a sunbeam and you realize nothing's ever going to be the same again? That was it for me. I stared at the old fields, the same ones Dad taught me to plow, the same porch where he'd told me stories about hard work and fairness, about never turning your back on your kin. And now that same name, Cole, was being signed away, not by a stranger but by my own brother. I called Daniel that afternoon. No answer. Tried again. Nothing. An hour later, I got a text. Just one line. "It's done, Rick. Dad wanted it this way. You should respect that." Respect that? My chest tightened like someone had tied a rope around it. I read the message over and over, trying to find a word that didn't sound like betrayal. But it was all there. Cold, dismissive, final. "You gotta understand something about my brother. Daniel's the kind of man who walks into a room and makes folks think he's the smartest one there. Always had that grin, that slick city confidence. The kind that gets people to trust him before they realize they shouldn't. He left town at 25, chasing money, deals, and whatever made him feel bigger than Cedar Falls. And me? I stayed, took care of Dad when the sickness came, ran the shop, paid the bills, buried the man who raised us both. But Daniel, he showed up when the dirt was fresh on Dad's grave, and now somehow, he'd walked away with everything. Something wasn't right. Dad wasn't a fool. He wasn't blind to what Daniel had become. He'd always said, "Rick, when I'm gone, you and your brother will stand side by side. 50-50, equal, because that's what a family is." So how in God's name did equal turn into everything to Daniel? I felt that old carpenter's anger rise in me, the kind that doesn't explode right away but builds slow, like heat in dry wood. My father's name was being used to cheat his own son, and I wasn't about to let that stand. And that's when I remembered. Something so small, so quiet I'd almost forgotten it. It was a few months before Dad passed. He'd been sitting by the window, his voice barely more than a whisper. He said, "Rick, if anything ever feels off after I'm gone, don't believe the first story you hear. There's always another page, son. Always another page." Back then, I didn't know what he meant. But that memory hit me now like a hammer to the chest. Because there was another page. Another copy. A second will. One he told me about. Though not directly. Dad was a smart man. He'd seen the cracks forming in Daniel long before I did. He didn't trust easily, not even the system. And he sure as hell wouldn't leave everything to the son who only came home when money was on the table. No, there was more to this story. Something hidden, waiting. And I knew then and there, I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. If Daniel thought he could bury me under paperwork and pride, he'd forgotten who I was. I wasn't just Frank Cole's son. I was the man my father trusted to protect what was right, even if it meant standing alone. So that day, sitting on that porch with the cold wind biting my neck and a shattered mug at my feet, I made a promise. Not out loud, just one that burned deep enough to feel like truth. I swore I'd uncover the truth. I'd bring my father's real will to light, and I'd make Daniel face the mirror he'd been running from his whole damn life, because that day, the day I found out the truth, wasn't the day I lost everything. It was the day I started taking it all back. Daniel and I, we came from the same blood, the same roof, the same rough old floors that creaked in winter and sweated in summer. But somewhere between those years, the bond that once made us brothers turned into a wall we could no longer see over. We grew up in Cedar Falls, a small town you could drive through in 7 minutes if you didn't hit the red light near Keller's Diner. Folks there knew everybody, your grandparents, your dog, your mistakes. Summers smelled like rain on dry dirt and fresh-cut lumber, and winters were so cold the rivers froze thick enough for kids to skate on. There wasn't much to do but work, dream, or leave. Dad ran Cole Carpentry, a workshop that sat right at the edge of town. It wasn't fancy. Just an old red barn with paint peeling off the doors and a tin roof that rattled every time the wind got mad. But that shop built most of Cedar Falls piece by piece. Houses, porches, fences, church benches, you name it, Dad had his hands in it. He believed in fixing what's broken, not throwing it away. Wood's like people, Rick, he'd say, sanding down an old board until it shined. You treat it right, it'll hold longer than you think. That was my father. Patient, honest, tough as nails but soft when it came to family. I was more like him than I ever realized. The quiet one. The steady one. The son who showed up early and stayed late. Who'd rather listen than talk. I didn't care much for attention. Just like the sound of saws buzzing, the smell of pine, and the peace that came with working with my hands. Then there was Daniel. My little brother by 3 years, but he always acted like he was the older one. He had that spark in his eyes, that charm that made folks listen, always talking about getting out and making it big. While I stayed close to home, Daniel looked at Cedar Falls like a cage. He wanted the world, and he wanted it fast. I remember him packing his bags the first time he left for college. He stood in the doorway of the workshop, looking around like he'd outgrown the place. "You should come with me." "Rick," he'd said, smiling that half grin of his, "there's a whole world out there. Don't you want to see it?" I told him the truth. Dad needs me here. The shop needs me. He laughed. "You're gonna spend your life fixing tables and fences? That's not living, that's waiting to die." He walked away that day. And maybe that's when the distance began. Years rolled by. He called sometimes. Holidays, birthdays. But after a while, the calls stopped. When Dad got sick, I tried reaching him. Told him the cancer was getting worse, that the doctors didn't think he had long. Daniel said he'd try to come, but he never did. Dad never said it out loud, but I could see it in his eyes every time we sat together on that back porch. He was waiting for Daniel. Waiting for his boy to come home, but Daniel never came, not until it was too late. The day of the funeral, I saw that slick black car pull up near the church steps. Out came Daniel, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my truck, sunglasses hiding his eyes, gold watch flashing in the sun. He walked like he owned the place, like grief was just another meeting he had to attend. He hugged me, quick and cold. "Sorry I missed the last few weeks," he said. "The last few weeks?" I wanted to ask. Try the last few years. But I didn't. I just nodded and let him think the silence meant forgiveness. After the funeral, he stood near the casket, hands in his pockets, talking to the lawyer. I remember thinking, how can someone look so polished standing over our father's grave? I told myself not to judge. Maybe that's just how he coped. But deep down, I knew Daniel had changed. The boy who once shared peanut butter sandwiches with me under the oak tree had turned into a man who only showed up when there was something to gain. And a week later, I found out just how much he'd gained. Daniel moved fast. Too fast. Calls to the bank, meetings with lawyers, signatures on papers I hadn't even seen. One day, the workshop still had Cole Carpentry written on its sign. The next, it said Cole Innovations. He called it modernizing Dad's legacy. I called it erasing him. Folks around town started whispering. Small towns love their whispers. They said Daniel had inherited everything, the land, the shop, even the old house by the river. I remember standing outside Keller's diner one morning when Old Man Keller leaned over his cup of coffee and said, "Heard your brother got it all." "Rick, the will was real clear about that, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, that's what they're saying." But inside something twisted in me. A deep, cold ache I couldn't shake. That shop wasn't just a building. It was our father's hands turned into wood and walls. Every nail, every plank had a memory. And now it belonged to someone who hadn't been around long enough to smell sawdust on his clothes. At night, I'd sit on that porch and stare at the dark outline of the workshop. I could almost hear Dad's hammer echoing, the rhythm of work and love that built our whole lives. I'd remember Daniel as a boy, barefoot and laughing, running around the place. And I'd wonder, where did that boy go? When did he trade sawdust and sweat for silk ties and silver tongues? Sometimes I blamed myself. Maybe I should have gone after him, pulled him back when he started slipping away. But the truth is, Daniel didn't want to be pulled back. He wanted to rise above Cedar Falls, and he didn't care who he stepped on to do it. And yet, a part of me still wanted to believe there was something good left in him, that maybe grief had just made him cold, not cruel. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Daniel wasn't grieving, he was calculating, and soon, I'd learn just how far he'd go to claim what was never fully his. Because betrayal doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with silence, with unreturned calls, with the way someone stops looking you in the eye. By the time I realized what he'd done, the damage was already spreading like rot through old wood. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could feel it, something inside me shifting. The kind of shift that happens when love turns into suspicion and brotherhood turns into war. The night I went back to the workshop, the sky was the color of old denim, that soft, heavy blue that makes everything look smaller and lonelier. The town lights were thin and scattered like a handful of coins dropped across a dark floor. I parked my truck where I always did, the gravel crunching under my boots, and for a moment I just stood there listening. The world out here had a way of speaking in small sounds. A loose shutter tapping, a dog barking 2 streets over, the far-off sigh of a tractor. But inside that shop the sounds were memories. Dad's laugh caught in a wood chip, the echo of his voice in the rafters. It all hit me like a punch. The door stuck a little at the top, swollen from years of weather. When it finally gave, I stepped inside and the smell hit me first. Sawdust, motor oil, the sweet dry scent of pine. It was exactly like it always had been. Everything was where he'd left it. Clamps hanging on nails, a radio that didn't work but stayed in the corner anyway, a stack of newspapers tied with twine. For a second I walked slow as if I was afraid to wake something that should be left sleeping. I ran my hands along Dad's old oak workbench the way you trace a photograph of someone you miss. The bench was scarred and stained in a pattern that only time and hard work can make. There were gouges and burn marks and a line where he'd measured years of projects with a bit of pencil and a memory. Beneath my fingers, the wood was warm from the day's sun and gritty with those fine shavings that cling to everything. My mind wandered to the way he used to stand there, shoulders hunched, brow furrowed, muttering under his breath as he coaxed a stubborn joint into place. I could hear him clear his throat, his voice low and steady. "A man's worth ain't in what he owns, Rick. It's in what he builds." He said that like it was gospel. Like it was the one true thing he wanted to leave behind that had nothing to do with houses or land. I started sorting through the drawers, more out of habit than purpose. Old tools tend to tell stories if you listen. A plane with a worn handle from shaping 100 chair legs, a chisel nicked on its edge where someone had been a little too eager. The bottom shelf held the things Dad kept close but didn't show off. Rags, a faded baseball cap, a box of nails. That's when I saw it. A small drawer set low to the floor, tucked into the bench's frame like it was ashamed to be seen. I'd noticed it 1,000 times before, saw the seam, felt the different grain, but I'd never had the key. Dad kept things close to his chest in the way old men do. There was a memory prickling at the back of my head, like something nudging me awake. A month before he died, Dad had handed me a little bronze key, the kind you get with an heirloom watch, the kind that carries the weight of someone's trust. He'd pressed it into my palm, and for a minute we both just looked at it. He said nothing then. Maybe he didn't have to. Sometimes a man can say everything with something as small as that. The key had lived in my pocket since his funeral like a hot coal. I fished it out now, the metal warm from my body, and knelt down. The key slid into the lock like it had been waiting for me. There's a particular kind of silence that happens right before you find something you didn't know you needed. The drawer gave when I turned the key. It was a simple click, but it sounded like a confession. Inside was an envelope. The paper had browned a little at the edges and smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. My name was written on the front in Dad's hand, his old deliberate scrawl that hadn't wavered much even in the end. I sat back on my heels and for a minute just stared at it, like the world had contracted down to that small rectangle of paper. My fingers were a little clumsy as I opened it. I wasn't ready for the letterhead or the legal language. I wasn't ready to see that neat signature at the bottom, his name written in full, solid as a promise. It was a will. Not just any will, but the second copy he'd said nothing about in words and everything about in that key. I read it twice, then a third time because the second read refused to be real. The will split everything, house, land, workshop, the truck, the old tools, equally between Daniel and me. It stated clearly what Dad had always told me. Fairness, the dividing of things he'd spent his life building. But at the bottom, in a place where you'd expect only formalities, there was a line scrawled in his handwriting, messier, like he'd been forcing the words out with what strength he had left. If Daniel changes, he'll earn it. If he doesn't, you'll know what to do. Those words hit me harder than any legal paragraph could. They weren't instructions so much as a map through a moral maze. I could almost hear his voice, tired but sharp. If he changes. He meant the Daniel that had left with bright ideas and came back different, polished up and distant. He meant the idea that sometimes a man can be seduced by what he thinks is better and forget what he had. You'll know what to do. I had the key. I had the second will. There was a responsibility planted in my chest like an ember. A storm of things rushed up after that. Betrayal, anger, gratitude, a weighty clarity. Betrayal because Daniel had accepted everything without earning it. Gratitude because Dad had trusted me enough to hide a second truth. Clarity because suddenly I had a direction that turned the pain into purpose. The workshop around me seemed to hold its breath. Every chip of wood and every rusted tool felt like a witness to the promise Dad had tucked away. All those hours I'd spent with him, learning the right way to choose wood grain, learning to listen to a board that only wants to be straightened, learning that patience is sometimes the only honest currency, came back like tuition finally paid. My hands shook a little as I pulled the paper closer and smoothed it out. The ink had bled where the river of his last days had blurred on the edge, but the words were as sharp as ever. He'd dated it a week before he passed. He had time to think it through. He had time to weigh the son who'd stayed and the son who'd only come when it suited him. He left me this second copy not to start trouble but to guard what he thought right. It felt like a trust, like being handed a small fragile torch and told to keep it from going out. I thought of Daniel then, of the way he'd stood at the funeral like a man auditioning for a part. I thought of the message he'd sent, so casual, so cold, telling me to respect his actions. Respect. The word tasted bitter now. Fury sputtered under my skin, but along with it was a careful, hard sense of duty. Dad didn't give me this to lash out with. He gave it to me to set the record straight, to protect the hands that had built our town, and to make sure his memory didn't get polished away by someone who hardly remembered where he came from. Sitting there on the cold floor with that will in my hands, I felt the first real responsibility of my adult life settle on me. It wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about truth, Dad's standard of fairness, the way he thought men should be measured. It was about proving to the town and to myself that we could stand for something that wasn't flashy or quick. It was about making Daniel face what he had become. By the time I left the workshop that night, the air had gone sharp and the stars were thin pricks. I locked the drawer back, turned the key twice like the motion might seal the promise I carried, and slipped the second will into my coat. I didn't go home and shout or tell the whole town. I drove slowly like a man who had something heavy in his lap and wanted to make sure he didn't drop it. Every mile felt like a step toward a fight I'd been trained for since I was a kid, built on patience, on the slow work of fixing what's broken. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat in my kitchen and read the will again under the yellow light of the lamp, the words carving themselves into my mind. Dad's handwriting seemed to anchor me. It was proof that this wasn't my pride talking. It was his last voice guiding me. I could feel the weight of the choice he'd given me. It wasn't simply to stand up and claim, but to make sure the claim was deserved. He'd left me the means to make that judgment. He trusted me to be fair, and with that trust came a resolve. This wasn't about revenge in the ugly sense. It was about justice measured by Dad's hands, steady, fair, and honest. It was about making Daniel answer for what he'd done, not in front of a mob, but in front of the truth. The secret in the drawer had handed me a responsibility I never asked for and a mission I couldn't ignore. I folded the will gently like something fragile and tucked it where only I would know. Then I sat back, let the silence of the workshop wash over me, and for the first time since the phone call from the lawyer, I felt something close to purpose. The next morning rose heavy and gray, the kind of dawn that doesn't promise much light. I barely touched the coffee I'd made. It sat cooling on the counter while I stared out at the yard, replaying every word from the night before. Sleep had come in pieces, restless and thin. The second will, Dad's true words, burned in my mind like a brand I couldn't put out. I kept seeing his handwriting, those final lines etched with the kind of conviction that only comes from a man who's already made peace with what's to come. "You'll know what to do," he had written. I didn't know what doing would look like, not yet, but I knew where I had to go. By mid-morning I was behind the wheel, the tires humming low against the cracked country road that led to the old coal house, Dad's house, though Daniel had already claimed it like a trophy. The sky hung low, clouded and dull, but the world around me looked sharper somehow. Every fence post, every patch of field, every turn of the road felt like it remembered something. It was the same road Dad had taken me down countless times, teaching me how to drive in his old pickup, warning me to respect the weight of what you're carrying. Now I carried something heavier than steel or wood, truth and all the danger that came with it. When I reached the house, it didn't even look like home anymore. The porch that once smelled of varnish and rain was stripped bare. The flower pots Dad had kept by the window, Mom's old habit he'd never let die, were gone. In their place were new metal chairs, sleek and meaningless. The air had a sterile kind of silence, the kind that sits wrong in a place meant to hold memories. I parked out front and just sat there for a minute, watching my brother through the open curtains. He was inside, moving about like a man setting up shop in someone else's soul. He'd gutted the place. I could see it through the glass. Dad's framed photos that once lined the hallway were gone, replaced with abstract paintings, empty shapes, cold colors. The old armchair, the one with the stitching Dad fixed himself after Mom died, was missing. The mantel was bare except for a silver clock that looked too clean, too new. I felt something twist inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was grief in another form. This house wasn't Daniel's. It was a story, and he'd rewritten it like it never belonged to anyone before him. I walked up to the porch, boots thudding against the wood that used to creak under Dad's steps. The door opened before I even knocked. Daniel stood there looking sharp in a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled up but too neatly to mean work. His hair was combed back, his expression unreadable, a businessman's face in a craftsman's house. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, slow and heavy, as if I were a problem he'd already solved. "Rick," he said, voice flat, like he was checking off a name on a list. "You shouldn't be here." That word, it hit me wrong. Shouldn't. Like I was trespassing on something sacred that no longer included me. I looked past him, into the house, at the stripped walls and gleaming furniture that didn't belong. "Shouldn't be here?" I repeated quietly. "This is Dad's home." He smirked, just a flicker, but enough. "Was," he said. "It's mine now. You weren't smart enough to fight for it." Smart, that word again. He'd been throwing it at me since we were kids, using it like a knife disguised as a compliment. Back then it was about grades, about ambition, about city versus town. He'd always said I was too simple, too attached to what didn't matter. Now he used it to twist the knife deeper. "Smart enough," I said, stepping inside. "To cheat, maybe. Smart enough to twist people around your finger." His jaw tensed, but he didn't move to stop me. I walked into the kitchen, the one Dad built with his own hands. The cabinet sanded smooth, the window overlooking the apple tree he planted the year I was born. The smell of fresh paint and lemon cleaner was everywhere. The warmth, the life that used to hum through the place, was gone. I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope. The second will. My heartbeat slowed to a deliberate rhythm as I slid it onto the counter between us. Then explain this, I said, my voice low but steady. Daniel's eyes darted to the envelope. And I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the quick flash of fear he tried to hide behind his practiced calm. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. Where the hell did you get that? I met his stare. From the man who actually loved us both. For a moment, something passed across his face, something that might have been guilt, or maybe just annoyance that I'd caught him off guard. He picked up the envelope, his fingers twitching slightly. Then his mask came back on. You think a piece of paper changes anything? He said. Lawyers already processed it. It's done. It changes everything, I said quietly. And you know it. That silence that followed felt like the air before a storm, dense, electric. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw what he'd become. Not my brother. Not even a man with reasons, just someone hollowed out by greed and pride. He moved before I could speak again, snatched the will, tore it right down the middle with a vicious, trembling motion. The sound of paper ripping felt louder than it should have, echoing through the house like a shot. He tossed the pieces onto the counter, breathing hard as if he'd just won something. There, he said. That's how much your little secret's worth. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the shredded pages, the handwriting now split apart, the ink of Dad's name torn clean through. My stomach tightened, but I stayed calm. Because what Daniel didn't know, what he would never think to consider, was that I'd already scanned the will, notarized it, and left copies with people who mattered. A lawyer Dad trusted, the bank manager who still owed him a favor. Even Mrs. Keller, the notary from town who'd seen me through every major decision I ever made. So I just said, you shouldn't have done that. He frowned. Why not? Because now, I said, you've made it clear what kind of man you are. And I've got proof of it. The color drained slightly from his face, but he held his composure, straightened his shirt, and forced a cold laugh. You think anyone will believe you? You've always been the sentimental one. The dreamer. People see what they want to see, and they see a man who can handle business, not one who lives in the past. His words landed like stones, but I didn't let them sink me. I looked around the house one last time. The bare shelves, the stripped rooms, the soul he'd vacuumed out of the place. Then I met his eyes, and for the first time in years, I didn't see my brother. I saw a liar wearing his face. This isn't about property anymore, I said softly. It's about truth, and who deserves to carry Dad's name. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between us said more than words ever could. I turned to leave, my boots dragging a bit against the tile, the house feeling colder with every step toward the door. Behind me, I could hear him breathing, sharp and shallow, the sound of a man realizing his lies had started to crack. Outside, the wind had picked up. It carried the smell of rain and something else, change. I stood on that porch, looked back at the house one last time, and whispered to myself what I should have said years ago. Dad, I'll make this right. And for the first time since he died, I felt him there. Not in the walls Daniel had painted over, not in the things he'd thrown away, but in the quiet certainty that truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds its way back home. Revenge doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with silence, with patience that cuts sharper than anger ever could. I'd learned that from Dad. He used to say, son, a man who swings too fast hits nothing but air. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what he meant. The morning after Daniel tore up Dad's second will, I sat in the workshop, the same one that had watched over my family for decades. The smell of sawdust still clung to the air, heavy and familiar. I ran my hands along the grooves in the old oak table, tracing the lines where Dad had carved his initials. Every dent, every burn mark from his tools was a reminder of the kind of man he was. Steady, deliberate, and fair. Daniel didn't know it yet, but I wasn't coming for him with rage. I was coming with purpose. For days I planned, quietly, methodically. I didn't tell a soul, not even my closest friend down at the diner. I started by pulling out the old family contacts, names Dad trusted, men and women who'd known the truth of his word for 40 years. People who still respected what Cole used to stand for before Daniel turned it into a brand. That's when I reached out to Mr. Thompson. He wasn't just a lawyer. He'd been part of our family in all the ways that mattered. He'd handled every Cole document since the workshop's first contract, from permits to Dad's first deed. The man was in his 70s now, gray hair combed neatly back, glasses perched on the edge of his nose, always smelling faintly of tobacco and paper. When he opened his office door and saw me standing there, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Richard Cole," he said, almost in disbelief. "It's been a while, son." "Too long," I answered, setting the folder on his desk. "I've got something you need to see." He opened it slowly, careful like the paper might crumble at his touch. The moment his eyes hit the first line of Dad's handwriting, his expression shifted. Shock, confusion, and something close to grief. "Richard," he breathed out, staring down at the signature. "This changes everything. If this is legitimate, and it sure looks like it, your brother's claim won't stand." I nodded, my jaw tight. "I'm not here just to win, Mr. Thompson. I'm here to make him face what he's done." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Then you've come to the right man." For the next hour, we went through the document line by line. Every clause, every date, every piece of evidence that connected Dad's intent to this second will. Turns out the language Dad used was airtight. He'd written a clause that covered what would happen if either of us acted in bad faith before the property was fully transferred. It was a failsafe, a moral test disguised as legal wording. "If Daniel takes or sells any property without your joint consent," Mr. Thompson explained, tapping the paper, "his claim becomes void. The entire estate reverts to equal ownership. Your father knew what he was doing, Richard. He built this safeguard for a reason." That line lit a spark in me. Dad had seen this coming. He'd left me the hammer, I just had to swing it the right way. So I formed my plan. Not a loud one, not a fight in the street kind of plan, but something cleaner. I decided to let Daniel bury himself. I played along, acted defeated. I started talking to people around town, telling them I was thinking about leaving Cedar Falls. I even spread the rumor that I was selling the workshop, the one Dad had built, the one Daniel wanted more than anything, because it wasn't just land. It was legacy. It was proof that he'd won, and like clockwork, word reached him. 3 days later, I got a call. "Rick," Daniel said, pretending to sound casual. "Heard you're thinking of selling the old shop." "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost tired. "Place doesn't feel the same without Dad. Thought maybe I'd just let it go." There was a pause on the other end, a faint exhale that sounded too pleased to be hidden. "Well," he said, "if you're looking to get rid of it, I might be interested, you know. To keep it in the family." I almost laughed at that, but I didn't. "You'd do that?" I asked, feigning gratitude. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "Tell you what, why don't I draw up an offer? I'll make it easy for you. Don't want you worrying about the legal side of things." Oh, he wanted it all right. His greed was predictable. He couldn't resist the idea of getting more for less. He'd been chasing shortcuts his whole life, and this was the biggest one yet. That night, I called Mr. Thompson. "He took the bait," I said. The old lawyer chuckled softly. "Then we'll make sure his signature seals his own undoing." We set everything up legally. Thompson drafted a purchase and ownership transfer acknowledgement, but hidden within its clauses was the trap. A direct acknowledgement that I was the lawful owner of the workshop under my father's revised and final testament, the second will. Once Daniel signed it, he'd be confirming my ownership under that will's authority. And once he acknowledged that, every illegal transfer he'd made so far would invalidate his previous claim entirely. It was poetic, really. He'd think he was buying control when in reality, he'd be handing it back. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at the workshop in that same pressed shirt, smelling of expensive cologne and self-assurance. He looked around the place like a man already picturing where he'd put his name on the wall. "Paperwork ready?" he asked, grinning. "Right here," I said, sliding the folder across the workbench. He barely glanced at the fine print. Of course he didn't. Daniel never cared for details. He cared for deals. He signed with a flourish, that smug little smile plastered across his face. When he handed the papers back, he said, "Well, looks like it's finally mine, brother." I smiled, slow and quiet. "You're right, Daniel. It's finally yours, on paper." He left whistling, pockets full of pride, completely unaware that he'd just signed his own downfall. When he was gone, I sat there alone in that workshop, the air thick with dust and sunlight. I looked at the spot where Dad used to stand, his back to me, working late into the night. I could almost hear his voice again, steady and low. A man's worth ain't in what he owns, Rick, it's in what he builds. And for the first time, I realized what I was building wasn't revenge, it was justice. Slow, patient, and precise. A week later, Mr. Thompson filed the paperwork. Daniel's signature confirmed the validity of the second will and invalidated every transfer he'd made before. Legally, the workshop, the land, and the coal estate were no longer his to claim alone. The trap had been built, and he'd walked right into it. But as satisfying as that was, I knew it wasn't over. Because the thing about revenge is, it doesn't just end when the law catches up. Sometimes the real reckoning comes when a man has to face the truth he's been running from his whole life. And Daniel's day was coming. The morning of the showdown was colder than it should have been for late spring. The sky had that washed-out gray that makes the world look like it's holding its breath. I stood outside the Cedar County office, my old truck parked crooked across 2 spaces, a habit I'd picked up when I stopped caring about how neat things looked. My hands were jammed deep in my jacket pockets, the will and the new legal documents folded neatly inside. Every sound, the squeak of the courthouse door, the low murmur of folks heading inside, the distant ringing of the flagpole chain felt sharper, louder, as if the whole town knew something was about to break. I wasn't nervous. Not in the way I used to be when Daniel was around. That old anxiety, the kind he used to stir up just by walking into a room, wasn't there anymore. What I felt now was colder, heavier, final. I'd waited my whole life for my brother to stand eye to eye with the truth, and today was the day he'd finally have to. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly over dull beige walls and government-issued furniture that had seen better decades. The air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Mr. Thompson was already seated at the long oak table, his glasses perched low on his nose, a neat stack of files arranged before him. A county clerk stood nearby, her laptop ready to record every word, every signature. "You ready for this?" Mr. Thompson asked quietly. "As I'll ever be," I said. My voice didn't shake. He nodded, glancing toward the door. "He's running late," I almost smiled. Daniel was always late. Late to Dad's appointments, late to help at the shop, late to remember that life wasn't about racing ahead of everyone else. But when the door finally opened and he walked in, I realized something. He wasn't late this time because of arrogance. He was late because he knew. Deep down, some part of him had already started to crack. He came in like he always did. Confident, pressed shirt, silver cufflinks gleaming, phone in hand like it was an extension of his ego. His cologne hit the air first, sharp and expensive. He looked at me and grinned, that same smug smirk he'd worn since we were boys. Well, he said, tossing his coat over the back of a chair. Big Brother finally came to make peace. I didn't answer. I just motioned to the papers waiting on the table. "Let's get this over with," I said. He chuckled, sliding into the chair across from me. "Always so dramatic, Rick. This isn't a war. It's business." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a checkbook, and scribbled fast, his pen moving with the confidence of a man who'd never once had to second-guess himself. When he was done, he tore the check free and slid it across the table. "Here's your check, Big Brother," he said with that same taunting smirk. "A generous offer considering what you're giving up." I looked at the check, then at him. The number was high, insultingly high, as if money could erase everything he'd done. I smiled back, slow and calm. "You might want to read the fine print." He frowned, confused for a second, then leaned over the documents. His eyes scanned line by line, lips moving silently as he read. At first there was nothing, just the sound of shuffling paper. Then his hand stopped. His brow furrowed. His eyes darted back to the first page, and then it hit him. He sat up straight, his color draining fast. "Wait, this says I'm transferring property to you?" The whole room went still. You could hear the air conditioner hum, the distant cough from a clerk in the hallway, the faint creak of Mr. Thompson's chair as he folded his hands together. "Yeah," I said softly. "Looks like Dad taught me a thing or two after all." Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking toward Mr. Thompson as if searching for a lifeline. "Mr. Cole," the lawyer said formally, adjusting his glasses, "by signing this document, you are acknowledging the legitimacy of the second will, your father's final and legally binding testament. It confirms that all property, including the workshop and the coal estate, falls under shared ownership as per those terms." Daniel's voice cracked. You tricked me." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. No, I said, steady as stone. You tricked yourself. For a moment there was fire in his eyes, the kind that once got him out of trouble, that sharp, calculating light that always made him dangerous. But now it just flickered, desperate like a candle in wind. He grabbed the pen again as if he could undo the ink already drying. You set me up, he hissed, his voice breaking through clenched teeth. I gave you a choice, I said. You just never thought I'd be smart enough to make it count. He stood so fast the chair screeched against the tile. Everyone in the office froze, unsure whether to step in or just watch the show. Daniel slammed his fist against the table, rattling the pens and papers. You think this means anything? He spat. I built this. I made it worth something. You were content wasting away in Dad's shadow. I met his glare, unflinching. You didn't build it, Daniel. You just sold it faster than you could understand what it meant. You wanted the name, not the work. You wanted the profit, not the pride. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His breath hitched, shoulders shaking slightly as reality began to set in. For once, his words, his greatest weapon, failed him. Mr. Thompson broke the silence. This hearing is officially recorded. The transaction is complete, Mr. Richard. Cole retains rightful ownership under the reinstated terms of Frank Cole's final will. Mr. Daniel. Cole's previous claims are hereby invalid. The clerk stamped the file with a heavy thud. That sound, clean, final, echoed like a gavel striking judgment. Daniel just stood there staring at the papers, his chest rising and falling too quickly. I'd seen him angry before, seen him smug, seen him lie his way through the impossible, but I'd never seen him silent. Not like this. He looked at me, eyes burning, not just with rage, but with something smaller underneath. Shame, regret, maybe both. His lips parted, but no sound came. The truth had stripped him bare. For a long moment we stood there, just two brothers on opposite sides of everything. Then he picked up the check, the one meant to buy my silence, and tore it clean in half, just like he'd done with Dad's will. The irony wasn't lost on me. He stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him so hard the glass rattled. And when the echo finally faded, all that was left was silence. The kind that stings more than any punch, because it carries everything words can't say. Mr. Thompson exhaled slowly, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. You did good, son, he said. I nodded, though it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. Watching Daniel fall wasn't satisfying, it was tragic. Because in another life, if things had gone just a little differently, maybe he wouldn't have needed to fall at all. I looked down at the papers one more time, my father's signature faint beneath the lamp's light, and whispered quietly, It's done, Dad, just like you wanted. But deep down I knew the story wasn't over. Revenge might have been complete, but the cost of it, the silence it left behind, was something I'd carry long after the ink dried. The weeks that followed felt slower than any I could remember, the kind of slow that comes after a storm, when the sky is too quiet and your hands don't quite know what to do without the weight of the fight. For days I'd wake up expecting another call, another argument, another round of papers or lawyers or shouting, but none came. The courthouse had made it official. The second will was legitimate, binding, and final. The land, the workshop, the old coal house, they were all returned, divided exactly as Dad had intended. When the final letter from the county arrived, I didn't open it right away. It sat on the workbench for a full day, the paper catching the sunlight that slipped through the dusty window. When I finally did open it, there was no rush of triumph, just a quiet kind of stillness, the kind that settles in your bones when something heavy finally sets down. Justice had been done, but peace? Peace was something else entirely. Daniel left town a week later. He didn't call, didn't write. He didn't even stop by the house one last time. I heard from a neighbor that he sold his car, packed a few boxes, and took off before dawn. There wasn't a goodbye note, not that I expected one. Just silence, his favorite kind of punishment. And maybe that was for the best. Some truths, once exposed, don't leave room for conversation. Still, I couldn't help but think about him. Every time I passed the empty chair at the workbench or saw the dent in the floorboards where he used to drop his hammer as a kid, I wondered if he ever thought about this, about what he'd lost, about what Dad really meant when he said, "A man's worth ain't in what he owns. Rick, it's in what he builds." Maybe he finally understood, or maybe he never would. The house itself had gone quiet too. For a while I couldn't step inside without hearing echoes. Dad's boots on the floorboards, his laugh in the hallway, the clatter of his old coffee mug on the kitchen counter. The place smelled like sawdust, old memories, and dusted wood polish. It was heavy but not suffocating. Like a museum of everything we'd been through, I decided not to sell. I couldn't. That place wasn't just walls and wood, it was the last piece of him that still breathed. So I rebuilt the workshop, not to run the old business, not for profit or legacy, but for something simpler, something real. I cleaned every shelf, replaced every cracked tool handle, and sanded down the oak bench until it shone again beneath the light. It was strange, how working with my hands started to feel like therapy. The sound of the saw, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the rhythm of a hammer meeting nail. It brought a kind of calm that no courtroom or lawyer could ever offer. I stopped thinking about revenge or justice. I started thinking about meaning. One morning, while I was fixing the hinges on a cabinet door, a boy from the neighborhood wandered in. He must have been around 12, shy, with dirt on his jeans and curiosity written all over his face. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was fixing what was broken. He came back the next day and the day after that. Then his friends started showing up too. Before long, the workshop wasn't quiet anymore. Laughter replaced the silence, and the air filled with the sound of young voices and the clinking of tools. I started teaching them small things: how to sand wood, how to build birdhouses, how to shape something with care and patience. It wasn't about teaching carpentry. It was about giving them what Dad had given me, a sense that building something with your hands builds something in your heart, too. Every evening, when the kids left and the sun dipped behind the trees, I'd step outside, wipe my hands on my apron, and stand by the porch. The light would spill across the fields, the same golden hue that used to hit Dad's shoulders when he'd stand there watching the world wind down for the day. Sometimes in that quiet, I swore I could still see him. His outline leaning against the railing, arms crossed, that half smile that meant everything was okay. It wasn't a haunting. It wasn't even grief. It was comfort. The kind that tells you some people never really leave, they just change form. They live on in the wood grain of an old table, in the sound of a hammer's echo, in the lessons they leave behind. The town started calling it Cole's Workshop again. Parents sent their kids there on weekends, and sometimes older folks dropped by just to watch. Word spread that the old place had life again, not the kind driven by business or money, but by purpose. Every nail I drove, every board I sanded, felt like closing a wound I didn't realize was still open. The revenge had ended, but the rebuilding, that was what truly healed me. And on quiet nights, when the sky turned that deep orange before fading into dusk, I'd look out over the porch and whisper into the wind, "The house stands again, Dad." And somehow I knew he heard me. You know, people have all sorts of opinions when it comes to revenge. Most folks will tell you it poisons your soul, that it eats away at you until there's nothing left but bitterness. Maybe they're right. Maybe for most people it does more harm than good. But sitting here now, after everything that happened, I can tell you it's not always that simple. Revenge, at least the kind I found, didn't destroy anything. It didn't burn bridges or leave scars that couldn't heal. What it did was restore something that had been stolen long before the will, long before the lies. It restored my peace. See, for years, I thought being the good brother meant staying quiet. I thought if I just kept my head down, worked hard and stayed decent, everything would work itself out. But life doesn't reward silence when truth is being buried. It rewards courage, the kind that stands up even when it shakes. That's what I learned through all of this. What happened with Daniel wasn't just about property or inheritance or some papers in a drawer. It was about worth, about what a man stands for when no one's watching. My father tried to teach us that lesson a long time ago, but I didn't really understand it until I was standing in the ashes of what our family used to be. Dad used to say, "A man's worth ain't what he takes. Rick, it's what he protects," and I used to think he meant protecting family or possessions, maybe even reputation. But he meant something deeper. He meant protecting yourself, your values, your integrity, the truth that lives inside you when everything else gets stripped away. When Daniel forged his path, when he twisted what was left of Dad's name, I realized something painful but necessary. Sometimes blood doesn't mean loyalty. Sometimes the people who share your past don't deserve a place in your future, and that's a hard truth to swallow. But it's a freeing one, too. I didn't set out to destroy my brother. I set out to remind him, if only for a moment, of the kind of men we were raised to be. Whether he learned that lesson or not, I can't say. Maybe someday he'll sit alone somewhere in some quiet town and realize what he lost wasn't land or money. It was legacy. And maybe, just maybe, he'll understand the difference between having something and deserving it. As for me, I don't carry anger anymore. Not toward him. Not toward what happened. Life's too short to hold grudges heavy enough to drown you. What I carry instead are the lessons. The kind that come wrapped in pain but leave you stronger when you finally unwrap them. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back in. It can just mean letting go of the weight they left behind. And peace, real peace, doesn't come from winning battles. It comes from knowing you did right by the truth. Sometimes I still get folks asking me if I ever regret it. If I wish I'd just walked away, let Daniel have everything, started fresh somewhere else. But you can't run from injustice and expect to find peace at the finish line. Peace doesn't follow cowards. It follows those who stand firm when it matters most. If my father were alive today, I think he'd be proud. Not because I won, but because I remembered what he stood for. Because I didn't let greed or fear shape me into something smaller than I was meant to be. I didn't fight for revenge. I fought for truth. And truth, when it's finally seen in the light, doesn't need to shout. It just stands there, steady, quiet, undeniable. So yeah, maybe revenge doesn't fix everything, but sometimes it fixes you. It clears your heart of doubt, it steadies your voice, and it reminds you who you are. If Daniel ever hears this, I hope he understands that I never hated him. I just couldn't let him erase the man who raised us, the man who taught us better. Because in the end, the measure of a man isn't found in the size of his house or the weight of his wallet or the papers that bear his name. It's found in what he protects when no one else is looking. And that's something I'll carry with me till the day I'm gone.